Tonight, I'll tell you the quiet and curious stories of the Tudor world. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and simply listen. Before we speak of kings, of queens, of vows spoken beneath vaulted ceilings, and of the quiet ambitions that drifted like candle smoke through the chambers of Tudor England, let us first arrive, slowly and without hurry, at the edge of that world. Imagine, if you will, a night in London, deep in the early 16th century, when the city is wrapped in rain and darkness, and the great tower stands beside the black water of the Thames like an old thought that has never entirely faded. The air is cold enough to settle upon the skin with a silvery delicacy, and the stones beneath one's feet, worn smooth by centuries of passing steps, hold the memory of countless winters. Somewhere beyond the walls, the river moves with a patient and secretive rhythm, lapping softly against timber and mooring rope, while above it the mist gathers, drifts, and folds itself into the night like pale linen being laid away. From a narrow window, latticed with dark lead, one might see only fragments of the city beyond. A wavering lantern, the blurred suggestion of rooftops, the dim outline of a church spire dissolved by rain. But inside, within the chambers of stone and oak and woven tapestry, the world is gentler, slower, almost suspended. A fire has burned low in the grate, leaving a bed of deep red embers that breathe their warmth into the room with a faint and intermittent sigh. A candle flame bends and gathers itself again. Another trembles in its brass holder, sending long and uncertain shadows over carved panels and heavy curtains. There is no haste here. Only the soft ticking passage of a world lit by wax and governed by bells. You may picture a corridor stretching away into darkness, its rushes sweetened faintly with herbs, its walls breathing out the chill of old masonry, its silence broken only by the distant footfall of a watchman making his measured round. Perhaps, from somewhere deeper in the palace, there comes the far-off murmur of prayer, or the rustle of a sleeve, or the creak of a door carefully opened and carefully shut. Such sounds do not disturb the night. They belong to it. They are the small domestic music of an age in which daylight was precious, and darkness was not banished, but simply inhabited. And if you allow yourself for just a little while to be drawn further inward, beyond the rain, beyond the tower, beyond the sleeping city, you may begin to sense the shape of England as it was then, a realm still young in its new dynasty, still remembering the bruised and uncertain years of civil conflict, still learning how to trust the fragile calm that had followed so many storms. The Tudor rose had not long been planted. Its petals were admired certainly, but its roots were yet being tested in the soil. Peace had come, but peace in such times was not a careless thing. It was tended, guarded, watched over in candlelight. For in those first Tudor years, much depended upon continuity, that quiet and ancient promise that one generation should hand its crown, its houses, its lands, and its uneasy blessings into the keeping of the next. A kingdom might survive hardship, taxation, winter, poor harvests, foreign suspicion, and the heavy tread of ceremonial duty. But uncertainty in succession was another matter entirely. It entered the imagination of a country like a draught under a door. One scarcely noticed it at first, yet before long the whole chamber felt cooler. Tonight, however, we do not begin with fear, nor with the hard outlines of later memory. We do not begin with the large and shadowed figure history would come to carve from the life of Henry VIII. Instead, we begin before all that, before disappointment had gathered its full weight, before longing had sharpened into insistence, before marriage, religion, and power had been pulled into a knot so tight that an entire kingdom would feel it. We begin, rather, with a boy who was not expected to be king. And there is, in that simple truth, a kind of softness. For the second son is often allowed a more graceful youth than the first. He may be educated with seriousness, certainly, but without the same crushing certainty of destiny. He may read, ride, dance, compose, argue, hunt, and shine in company with a freer step, because the future, it is assumed, rests elsewhere. So it was with young Henry Tudor, born in the summer of 1491 at Greenwich Palace, into a world where his elder brother Arthur stood first in line, and where his father, Henry VII, watched over the new Tudor settlement with a vigilance sharpened by experience. The England into which the young prince was born was not yet the lushly theatrical court that later generations would imagine when they spoke of Tudor pageantry. It was a court shaped, above all, by caution. Henry VII, the founder of the dynasty, had won his crown not by ease of inheritance, but upon the field at Bosworth, and one does not come through such a history without learning to count risks carefully. His court was orderly, disciplined, often splendid in appearance, but under its velvet and cloth of gold there beat a practical heart. Accounts were studied, alliances were weighed. Every marriage, every journey, every courtesy offered abroad or at home was part of the quiet architecture by which a fragile peace was made to endure. He was, from the first, a child upon whom attention settled naturally. Contemporary observers, and later those who look back through the gilded haze of memory, spoke of his physical gifts with admiring consistency. He grew into a tall, vigorous youth, broad in the shoulders, handsome in the face, bright in complexion, with that striking mixture of vitality and polish that courts find so difficult to resist. Yet physical beauty alone never explains fascination for long. There was also animation in him, an ease of manner, an appetite for display, a readiness to excel. He sang, played instruments, wrote, hunted, jousted, debated theology, and took pleasure in scholarship with a confidence that seemed at once princely and deeply personal. He was educated as a Renaissance prince ought to be educated, not merely to govern, but to embody a civilized ideal. One may imagine him in the schoolroom, where daylight falls in pale rectangles across wooden desks, and Latin phrases are recited in measured cadence beneath the supervision of learned men. His tutors would have guided him through scripture, history, music, languages, and moral philosophy, shaping not only his intellect but his sense of self. He learned to present himself as cultivated, devout, magnanimous, and capable, a prince fashioned for admiration. There is a quiet irony in this, of course, for the qualities that make a young man glitter in safety do not always prepare him to suffer contradiction in power. But that belongs to later chapters. For now, the light still lies kindly upon him. Outside the schoolroom, there were the ceremonial rhythms of royal life. Hunting parties moving through frost-bright fields, chapel services rich with incense and polyphony, banquets where silver caught the candlelight in 100 little moons, and winter entertainments in which masked figures glided through halls hung with arras and evergreen. To be a prince in such a world was to live always within theatre, but theatre of a particularly enveloping kind. Not a stage one stepped onto, but an atmosphere one breathed from childhood. And yet, even in those years, destiny was not absent. It merely stood at a little distance, waiting. Arthur, Prince of Wales, elder brother to Henry, was the intended future of the Tudor line. His education, his marriage, his ceremonial importance, all reflected that central place. In 1501, he was wed to Catherine of Aragon, the youngest daughter of the formidable Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. The match was politically exquisite. Spain was a rising power. The alliance brought prestige, protection, and an elegant strengthening of England's place in the diplomatic order of Europe. Catherine arrived in England as a princess of rare significance, carrying with her the dignity of one of Christendom's most powerful courts. It is worth pausing here, because Catherine enters the Tudor story not merely as a future wife of Henry, but first as the bride of Arthur, and as a young woman far from home, moving through damp English air beneath a sky very different from that of Spain. One may picture her journey through landscapes of bare winter branches, grey rivers, and clustered towns, her household travelling with trunks, reliquaries, fabrics, devotional objects, and the careful etiquette of a royal daughter. She was learned, pious, and trained from childhood in the demanding arts of queenship. There was seriousness in her, stillness, a composure that did not depend upon noise. Arthur and Catherine's marriage, however, was brief. The young prince, delicate in health, did not live long after the wedding, and with his passing, the line of Tudor succession shifted quietly, but irrevocably, toward his younger brother. There are moments in history that arrive not with trumpets, but with the closing of a single door. This was one of them. Henry, once the spare, became the heir. It is difficult to know exactly how the young prince experienced that alteration in his own heart. Perhaps with sorrow first, as any brother might. Perhaps also with the dawning. Sensation of doors opening one after another in corridors previously closed to him. What had been theoretical became immediate. The books, the lessons, the pageantry, the polished expectations, all were now directed toward a future crown. And then, in 1509, when Henry VII died, and the young Henry, only 17 years of age, ascended the throne as Henry VIII, England felt the atmosphere change almost at once. If the father had seemed careful, reserved, and at times shadowed by the memory of uncertainty, the son appeared in striking contrast. Radiant, confident, expansive, eager to be loved and seen. There was music in him, motion in him, a sense of abundance. Ambassadors wrote of his charm. Courtiers admired his athletic grace. The people, weary perhaps of caution, looked upon this youthful king with something very like relief. Here at last was a monarch who seemed born not merely to preserve the crown, but to wear it beautifully. One may imagine the first months of the reign as a season of brightness. The court became more generous in display, more buoyant in spirit, more willing to celebrate. Fabrics gleamed richer, tournaments flourished. Chapel observances retained their solemnity, but were now accompanied by the visible energy of a king who delighted in magnificence. Henry was not simply obeyed. He was admired in the way sunlight is admired after a long succession of overcast days. And among the first and most significant decisions of this new reign was his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. This union, though often remembered chiefly for its eventual unravelling, began under signs of mutual respect, political logic, and genuine warmth. Catherine, now widowed and long resident in England under circumstances not always easy, had endured years of uncertainty regarding her status and future. Yet she had maintained her dignity with remarkable steadiness. Henry, for his part, seems to have regarded her not as a burden of old diplomacy, but as a fitting queen. She was intelligent, poised, experienced in affairs of state, and possessed of a serene authority that complemented his youthful brilliance. Their wedding took place in June of 1509, not long after Henry's accession, and if we listen for the emotional texture, rather than merely the political fact, we may hear in that marriage the sound of something hopeful, even tender. The young king and queen were close in age, accomplished, and admired. In public, they formed a pair of great symbolic value. England and Spain joined, youth and legitimacy entwined, promise crowned by ceremony. Let us linger for a moment within the chapel. The air is cool, scented with wax and incense. The stone beneath embroidered slippers holds the ancient calm of sacred places. Candles rise in clusters, their flames lengthening and bending gently when doors open to admit attendants and nobles in layered silk and fur. Gold thread catches the low light. Voices murmur, then fall. Somewhere above, in the carved dark of the roof, music descends with a clarity that seems almost to suspend time. And there, before altar and witness, the king and his bride speak vows that must have sounded, in that hour, not like the beginning of tragedy, but like the proper settling of the kingdom into order. At first, much seemed to confirm that impression. Catherine proved herself an able queen, deeply devout, well-educated, and attentive to the ceremonial and charitable expectations of her role. Henry remained affectionate and admiring. They hunted together, presided together, prayed together, and occupied that early stretch of marriage with what appears, through the veil of time, to have been a real, if court-shaped companionship. There is no need to force darkness into these years too early. It is enough, and perhaps more truthful, to recognize that happiness may exist even in stories that later dissolve into sorrow. The Tudor court around them was a world rich in texture. Imagine dawn arriving pale and slow over the Thames, the river silver-grey beneath a winter sky, while servants stir the palace awake. Fires are coaxed back to life. Buckets echo in courtyards. Kitchens begin their fragrant labour long before sunrise. Bread warms. Spices are measured. Great joints are turned. Hounds bark in the distance. In royal chambers, curtains are drawn back just enough to admit a careful light. Attendants move quietly over rushes and polished boards, laying out garments lined with fur, fastening jewels, brushing velvet, warming water against the chill. Such details matter because monarchy, especially in this age, was not an abstraction. It was lived through rooms, objects, gestures, fabrics, scents, and repeated forms. Power had texture. Authority rustled. Legitimacy was embroidered, sung, and served in procession. The young king moved through all this with instinctive pleasure. He excelled in ceremonial life because he delighted in embodiment, in showing kingship as something visible, audible, and almost theatrical in its grace. There were revels in winter, when tapestries thickened the walls against cold and noble guests, watched dancers turn beneath candle-lit rafters. There were progresses in warmer months, when the court travelled, and roads filled with wagons, guards, clerks, ladies, grooms, hawks, hounds, trunks, and all the moving apparatus of majesty. There were hunting mornings washed with dew, and afternoons of music. There were debates among scholars, and whispered calculations among counsellors. There were chapels where Latin rose in measured beauty, and private rooms where letters were composed with care, folded, sealed, and sent abroad on horseback through rain or dust. And presiding over this bright, early world was a king still close enough to youth that expectation seemed a garment he wore easily. Yet even in the fairest palaces, beneath the smoothest ceremonies, a single quiet question may begin to echo. For a dynasty newly founded cannot live on splendour alone. It requires continuity. It requires heirs. And although Henry and Catherine's marriage opened under blessed signs, the hopes placed upon it were not merely romantic, nor even only diplomatic. They were biological, dynastic, pressing in a way that no embroidered celebration could permanently soften. The Tudor line, not yet old, not yet beyond challenge, needed sons. At first, there was every reason for confidence. The couple were young. The kingdom was hopeful. Prayer and medicine, custom and optimism all joined in patient expectation. Rooms might be prepared. Tiny garments might be sewn. Te Deums might be imagined in advance. Yet history, as we know, does not always deliver peace in the form most earnestly requested. Still, in this first chapter, we remain before the long winter of disappointment has fully settled. Here, the cradle has not yet become an emblem of anxious waiting. Here, Henry has not yet turned inward against frustration. Here, Catherine is not yet the isolated and steadfast figure of later years. Instead, we are in the gentler beginning, when the king is still resplendent, the queen still securely cherished, and the future has not yet shown the full pattern of its weaving. If you were to walk in imagination through Greenwich Palace at dusk in those early years, you might pass chambers lit from within by honey-coloured light, hear a fragment of song carried along a passage, catch the perfume of beeswax and rosemary, and see beyond the window the river darkening under evening cloud. A page hurries by with folded linen. Somewhere a clerk signs a document. Somewhere a lady kneels in prayer before retiring. Somewhere the king laughs, not loudly, but with that easy confidence which comes when one is still in harmony with one's own reflection. Such moments are easily overlooked in retrospect, because posterity is drawn toward fracture, yet the tenderness of beginnings deserves its due. Henry VIII did not enter the world already enclosed in the silhouette by which he is commonly remembered. He began as promise, the bright answer to a cautious father, the admired prince of a hopeful court, the scholar, athlete, musician king, whose early reign felt to many like a pageant of renewal. And Catherine, too, deserves to be seen in this first light, not merely as the abandoned queen she would one day become in popular memory, but as a royal woman of poise and intelligence, stepping with measured grace into the role she had been prepared for all her life. In those opening years, she was not standing against the current. She was moving with it. There is something almost seasonal about this portion of the Tudor story. It is spring-like, though touched with English reserve, full of brightness, though not without cloud, musical, ceremonious, fragrant with beginnings. One can feel the kingdom exhale, just a little, beneath the new reign. The long calculations of foundation seem, for a moment, vindicated. The young monarch is splendid. The queen is honourable. Europe watches with interest. The churches ring. The cloth of gold glows. The horses stamp in their stalls. The cooks labour before dawn. The priests lift their voices. The courtiers bow. And over all of it hangs that delicate and persuasive illusion that beauty and order, once attained, may simply continue. But history, like weather over the Thames, is seldom so still. Not tonight, however. Tonight we stop before the first winds truly rise. We leave Henry as the Golden Prince King, vigorous and admired, moving through polished halls and chapel light with the confidence of youth still undivided from destiny. We leave Catherine at his side, composed and stately, not yet shadowed by years of trial, but settled within the dignity of queenship. We leave the Tudor court shimmering in candlelight, its music unbroken, its prayers ascending into carved darkness, its future not yet burdened by all that will later be asked of it. And as the hour grows quieter, imagine once more the old stones cooling under night air, the rain tracing silver paths down narrow panes, the fire sinking gently into embers, and the palace itself entering that peculiar stillness known only to great buildings after midnight, when conversation has faded, when footsteps have thinned, and when all the ambitions of the day, even royal ones, seem for a little while to rest beneath the same dark and merciful sky. In that hush, the young Tudor world lies sleeping. The candles shorten, the river goes on moving, and somewhere, just beyond the edge of this tranquil beginning, time waits with folded hands, the first queen and the long winter of waiting. Let us return gently and without any haste to Tudor England, where the night gathers once more around palace walls, and where the chambers of kings and queens, though made splendid by velvet, carved oak, and cloth of gold, remain no less vulnerable to silence than any humbler room. Outside, the air is cool with river mist, and the great body of the Thames moves beneath the dark like a patient animal, unseen but always near, brushing softly against the foundations of wharves and towers. The rain, which in London so often seems less to fall than to linger in the air itself, has settled into a fine and steady veil, whispering upon windows, tracing the outlines of stone, and dimming the city into a wash of muted silver and shadow. Within the palace, the hour is late enough that most doors have been closed, yet not so late that all wakefulness has vanished. Somewhere along a corridor, a taper burns low in an iron bracket, and the flame, stirred by the smallest draught, bends and steadies again, as though breathing in its sleep. The rushes upon the floor carry the soft fragrance of herbs long since bruised under passing feet. A servant moves quietly in another room, setting aside a basin, folding linen, banking the fire. The chamber settles. A log shifts in the grate with a small and companionable sigh. Then stillness returns, broad and deep, and almost kind. Imagine, if you will, that we are standing for a moment not in the bright public rooms of ceremony, but a little behind them, in the half-lit spaces where royal life loses none of its importance, yet becomes more human in its rhythms. Here are prayer stools polished by use. Here are books with worn clasps and margins touched by thoughtful fingers. Here are cushions placed near chapel windows, where a queen might sit in the pale morning light before the day's duties begin. Here are the objects of ordinary persistence: a half-finished piece of embroidery, a devotional image, a pair of gloves laid carefully beside a folded letter, a rosary catching the firelight in beads of dark amber. For in this chapter, we move away from the radiance of accession, away from the fresh splendor of a youthful king and his noble bride, and enter a slower season. Not one of open rupture, not yet, but of waiting, and of the subtle chill that enters a life not through one decisive grief, but through many repeated absences. The marriage of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, which had begun beneath the warm and orderly signs of promise, now finds itself measured by a question as ancient as monarchy itself. Who shall come after? And there is, perhaps, no form of waiting more quietly exhausting than the waiting attended by hope. In the early years of their marriage, there was every reason for England to expect continuity. Henry was young, vigorous, and admired. Catherine was capable, deeply respected, and still well within the years in which a royal household might reasonably anticipate children. The court, with all its observances and prayers, looked naturally toward the future. In a kingdom still not so distant from the uncertainties that had accompanied the Wars of the Roses, the matter of succession was not abstract. It was not a tidy concern to be addressed in documents and then forgotten. It lived in memory, in caution, in the shape of conversations held behind closed doors, and in the unspoken calculations of all who understood that a secure line of inheritance meant peace, while an uncertain one might invite old troubles to stir again from sleep. At first, this concern was softened by confidence. There would be children, there would be sons. Time itself seemed an ally. And so, the days passed with the measured grace of royal life. Hunts in the clear air of autumn mornings, feast days marked by solemn music and embroidered vestments, winter nights warmed by braziers and torchlight, summer progresses through green estates where the court moved like a great colourful tide across the countryside. Yet beneath all this movement, there began, very slowly, to gather a stillness of another kind. Catherine, as queen, brought to her role a seriousness that was neither cold nor severe, but disciplined and inwardly anchored. She had been raised amid the formidable statecraft and piety of Spain's ruling house, where queenship was understood not merely as ornament, but as vocation. Her education had been substantial, her religious formation deep, her sense of dignity firm without ostentation. In England, she adapted with remarkable patience to a court not entirely like the one she had left behind, and to a climate, both literal and political, that could at times feel less golden than damply watchful. Yet she carried herself with composure. She was learned enough to converse intelligently in matters of religion and governance, devout enough to command respect in chapel, and gracious enough to fulfill the many visible obligations of queenship without apparent strain. If Henry in these years was sunlight, Catherine was something steadier, a lamp kept well trimmed against the dusk. There is a temptation, when looking back through history, to see such steadiness as merely passive. But this would be a mistake. Catherine's endurance was active. It was made each day in choices of manner, in constancy of devotion, in the maintenance of ceremony, in the endless discipline of appearing equal to events even when inwardly burdened by them. A queen could not simply feel. She must continue. She must pray in public, receive ambassadors, answer letters, intercede where fitting, preside with calm at table, and embody reassurance for a kingdom that watched not only her person, but her womb, her health, and the future she represented. One may imagine her rising early before the palace is fully awake, when the light beyond the casement windows is still pearl grey and uncertain, and the morning fire has only just begun to lift the chill from the chamber. An attendant parts the curtains. A gown is laid out. Water, gently warmed, waits in a basin. Somewhere in the passage, footsteps are muffled by rushes, and beyond these small practical sounds lies the day's larger rhythm. Mass, correspondence, audience, meals, observance, duty. In such routines, the mind may at times find comfort, but routine can also become the frame within which disappointment is silently counted. For Catherine did conceive, and more than once the kingdom leaned forward in expectation. It is difficult, even now, not to feel the tenderness and ache folded into those moments. A court would begin to arrange itself around anticipation. Prayers would be offered. Physicians and attendants would come and go with careful seriousness. Tiny garments may have been prepared in hope, furnishings placed, names considered, messages drafted in readiness for joyful dispatch. In the hush before royal confinement, time itself seems to change its pace. Every room listens, and then, too often, silence followed. We need not dwell upon the particulars in a manner that troubles the heart. It is enough to say that the early years of the marriage were marked by repeated sorrow in the nursery, and by hopes that bloomed only briefly before being folded away. One child, then another, then the fading of expectation. Joy entering the palace like a shaft of morning sun, and then receding behind cloud before noon. Such experiences, especially when repeated, alter the emotional climate of a household. Not always openly, and not all at once, but perceptibly. Rooms once prepared with eager purpose acquire a different stillness. Congratulations are offered more cautiously. Prayers become more fervent and more tired. To the people beyond the court, these events would have been understood not merely as private grief, but as matters bound to the kingdom's peace. To Catherine herself, they were surely both things at once. Personal losses borne in the body and soul, and public failures judged according to a standard no woman, however noble, could entirely escape. Queens were loved, admired, and dressed in state, but they were also asked with ruthless gentility to secure dynasties through childbirth, and to do so while remaining graceful under scrutiny. Henry too was affected, though in his earlier years one suspects he met disappointment first, with hope renewed rather than with bitterness. He was not yet the hardened figure of later memory. He prayed, he waited, he trusted that time would still bring him what he desired. And perhaps, because youth often mistakes delay for mere inconvenience, he did not at first believe that heaven, nature, or fate would deny him indefinitely. In 1516, after earlier losses, a daughter was born who lived, Mary. Her arrival brought genuine rejoicing, and rightly so. The child was healthy, the mother survived, and the court, after so much uncertainty, could at last cradle something enduring. One may picture the bells sounding over London in softened celebration, and courtiers moving through corridors with lighter steps, and the Queen, tired but relieved, holding the infant in a room sweet with wax, linen, and the fading heat of the birthing fire. A daughter was not the son the kingdom longed for, yet she was no small blessing. She was living continuity, however imperfectly it answered the dynastic wish of the age. For a time, Mary's presence may have eased something in the royal household. Children alter the atmosphere of rooms. Their breathing softens night vigils. Their garments, toys, attendants, and routines establish a domestic rhythm that even splendor must adapt itself around. In nurseries and privy chambers, there would have been nurses, rockers, whispered songs, folded swaddling cloths, little caps stitched with care, and all the small repetitive acts by which an infant life is tended into the world. To imagine Catherine in such surroundings is to glimpse not merely a queen, but a mother, one who had waited, grieved, hoped again, and who now had in her arms a child whose very existence must have felt both precious and precarious. Yet Mary's birth did not resolve the larger tension. She was cherished, but she was not a son. And in Tudor political thought, that distinction was immense. A daughter might inherit in theory, but in practice the prospect of female succession sat uneasily upon the imagination of many in England and abroad. Memory of disputed claims was too near, precedent too thin, anxiety too deeply rooted. The cradle was no longer empty, but the question remained unanswered. This is where the marriage begins to enter its long winter of waiting. Not because affection vanished at once, nor because conflict had yet crystallized into open estrangement, but because repetition changes the texture of hope. When the first expectation fails, one grieves and begins again. When the second fails, one consoles oneself with patience. When hope is disappointed repeatedly over years, however, even a bright court learns to carry itself more quietly around the subject. Smiles become more careful. Letters grow more deliberate in tone. A phrase such as "God willing" begins to bear the weight of fatigue. Around them, the pageant of kingship continued. Henry remained active in sport, governance, ceremony, and continental ambition. He delighted in tournaments and in the visible performance of magnificence. He cultivated the image of a princely ruler in the full Renaissance mold. Learned, athletic, devout, and splendid. Foreign ambassadors observed him closely. Courtiers clustered around him in the hope of favor. Musicians, artists, and scholars enriched the court. Great cloths, jewels, plate, and architecture all contributed to the impression of a reign that wished to be seen as abundant and secure. And yet there are moments in history when the most glittering surfaces seem only to throw into sharp relief the silence beneath them. What use, after all, is a magnificent procession if the line it celebrates remains uncertain? What comfort does a tournament offer at night, when the torches are extinguished and the question of succession returns to sit at the bedside like an old and unwelcome familiar? One may imagine Henry in private, not as later caricature, but as a man still vigorous, still admired, still pleased by display, yet beginning to feel the first interior abrasion, between what he expected life to grant him and what it had thus far withheld. Such abrasions are often invisible to others at first. They do not transform character overnight, but they accumulate. A thwarted desire, particularly in one accustomed to excellence, may settle in the mind as a small, hard seed, and with time it may put out roots in many directions. Catherine, for her part, seems to have met these years with prayer and perseverance. There is something deeply moving in her constancy. She did not rage publicly against Providence. She did not retreat from duty. She remained queenly, observant, generous to the poor, serious in religion, and faithful to the role she had vowed to inhabit. If sorrow marked her, it did not make her theatrical. Rather, it appears to have deepened that grave and almost luminous steadiness for which she would later be so widely respected. Let us step for a while into the chapel, where so much of Catherine's inward life may be felt, if not fully known. The stone is cold, though carpet and cushions soften the place where she kneels. The air smells of wax, old wood, and incense absorbed over generations into the pores of the building itself. Light from the candles does not conquer the shadows, but merely warms them. Latin prayers rise and fall like the tide. A priest's voice travels gently beneath the vaulted roof. Somewhere in the coloured glass, morning has begun to brighten. Catherine, wrapped in velvet against the chill, lowers her head and entrusts grief, petition, memory, and patience to a silence she believes is listening. How many times did she pray for a son? We cannot know, but one suspects the number was great, and prayer, even when sincere, does not always still anxiety. It may instead teach one to carry it with greater composure. The court, meanwhile, watched. Courts always watch. They notice the subtleties of favour, the patterns of access, the degree of warmth in public gestures, the nature of private absences. They note whether the Queen's position seems secure, whether physicians are more frequently summoned, whether ambassadors ask more pointedly after the succession, whether councillors gather in quieter clusters than before. The life of a palace is made partly of overt ceremony and partly of interpretation. A look, a delay, an omission, a rumour carried softly from one chamber to another. These become the weather by which ambitious men and observant women navigate. Still, in these years, the break had not come. If unease had entered, it had done so like winter fog, not in a dramatic rush, but by degrees, softening edges, blurring distances, settling first in low places, and then more generally over the land. The king and queen continued together. Public forms were maintained. Affection had not yet given way to repudiation. But the nursery, which should have secured the future, remained instead a room of repeated uncertainty. One of the most touching qualities of this period is that it contains real devotion side by side with growing tension. Human lives are rarely tidy enough to divide neatly into love and unlove, joy and sorrow. loyalty and fracture. The early marriage of Henry and Catherine was not a fiction later exposed. It was rather a living bond placed under pressures it could not indefinitely absorb. The tragedy is gentler and perhaps therefore sadder when seen in that light. Seasons passed. Christmases came with evergreen garlands, music, and candle-lit feasts. Lent returned with its fasting and solemnity. Spring brought hawking and renewed court travel. Summer unfurled green landscapes and the fragrance of herbs in palace gardens. The king rode, hunted, and displayed himself with brilliance. The queen received, prayed, corresponded, and endured. The child Mary grew. Europe shifted in its alliances and rivalries. Diplomacy unfolded in letters sealed with wax and borne over rough roads and uncertain seas. And through it all, one desire remained at the centre of the royal household, like a lamp that would not go out, though its flame had begun to flicker in the draught: a son. In another sort of story, the answer might have come in time, and all that followed might have slept forever in the realm of unrealized possibility. But history is not arranged for our comfort. It unfolds according to a logic at once intimate and immense, wherein private longing may alter laws, churches, marriages, and nations. The sorrow of a queen, the impatience of a king, the absence of one desired child. These are not, in Tudor England, merely personal matters. They are fault lines beneath the polished floor. Yet here, in Chapter 2, the floor has not yet split. It only creaks faintly under strain. There may have been evenings, one likes to imagine them, though history leaves them largely undescribed, when Henry and Catherine sat together in relative quiet, relieved for a little while of audiences and ceremony, while the fire lowered itself into embers and the palace darkened beyond their chamber. Perhaps there was conversation of music, of Spain, of scripture, of courtly gossip softened by familiarity. Perhaps there were moments in which sorrow retreated and companionship returned in simple form, as it sometimes does between people long joined by duty and habit as well as feeling. Such moments do not erase tension. They merely remind us that before relationships become symbols in history, they are lived as days and nights. And nights, especially in old palaces, are full of thought. Outside, the watch changes. Rain gathers in the gutters. Horses shift in the stables. Somewhere along the river, a boatman calls softly into mist. The city, though dimmed, never wholly ceases. Within, the queen may wake and lie listening, one hand resting upon the coverlet, while her mind moves through prayer, memory, and fear with the patient familiarity of someone long practiced in restraint. The king, in another hour or another chamber, may stare at a dying fire and think not of philosophy or pageantry, but of inheritance, of a son not yet given, of a line not yet secured, of the crown as something that must outlast not only him, but uncertainty itself. Thus the long winter begins, not with snow, not with spectacle, but with repeated waiting, and with the gradual cooling of confidence into concern. and so we leave them for now in that suspended season. Catherine remains the first queen, dignified, devout, and enduring, still moving through the ordered rituals of royalty with admirable composure. Henry remains not yet broken from her, but inwardly altered by the first persistent resistance of fate. Their daughter Mary lives, cherished and watched over. The court continues its beautiful performances. Candles are lit, masses are sung, letters depart into the rain. Yet the future, though not yet dark, has grown less certain than before. The embroidered cradle, once a promise, has become a question. The prayer book remains open. The bells continue to ring across the river, and over the roofs of Tudor London, beneath a sky of low cloud and silver rain, hope itself has learned to speak more softly, the silk whisper of Anne Boleyn. Let us return once more to Tudor England, though not now to the still and prayerful chambers where patience had learned to endure in silence, but to a court beginning almost imperceptibly to alter its temperature, as though a door had opened somewhere in a long corridor, admitting a draught no one at first could name. Outside, evening gathers over the river in folds of pearl-grey mist, and the sky above London, so often a low canopy of cloud, has the colour of watered silk. The stones of the palace courtyards hold the day's dampness and release it slowly into the cooling air. A lantern swings on its iron bracket, tracing a soft arc of light over wet flagstones. Somewhere in the dark, a horse stamps gently in its stall. Somewhere else, from a far interior chamber, there rises the muted, graceful sound of a lute. If one were to walk now through the royal apartments at dusk, one would find the evening not asleep, but half awake in that delicate hour when ceremony has relaxed only slightly, and private life has not yet wholly begun. Candles are being lit one by one, and with each flame the tapestries stir into warm visibility. Saints, hunts, forests, mythical beasts, all blooming from shadow in gold and faded crimson. The air carries beeswax, cedar, wool, and the faint sweetness of crushed herbs laid among the rushes. Silks rustle. Rings catch the light. Voices remain low, though laughter from another room arrives now and then in brief soft waves before dissolving again into the general hush. In such an atmosphere, change may come not as a blow, but as a presence. And so, before we speak of policy, conscience, ambition, or the slow bending of a kingdom around a single royal desire, let us first attend to that presence, to the subtle shift in current that passes through a court when one person enters it with enough style, intelligence, reserve, and mystery to alter the angle at which others begin to look. For Anne Boleyn does not appear in the Tudor story like a storm announced in advance. She arrives more delicately than that, and more dangerously. She is not at first the central figure around whom empires of interpretation will later be constructed. She is a lady among ladies, a woman of notable charm and distinction, in an environment already rich with display. And yet, from the beginning, there is something about her that catches her attention, not because she seeks to dominate a room by force, but because she seems to know precisely how to stand within it without being absorbed. We might imagine her first not in England, but abroad, where part of her refinement was formed. Anne had spent years in the Netherlands and in France, and this mattered. Courts shape the body as much as the mind. They teach tempo, gesture, conversation, attire, and the 1,000 tiny calibrations by which a person learns how to be seen. French court culture in particular, with its Polish wit, music, and cultivated grace, left its mark upon her. When Anne returned to England, she brought with her not merely foreign fashions or fluent manners, but an entire atmosphere, an elegance that seemed lighter, sharper, and more elusive than the heavier solemnities of older forms. It is often said that she was not considered a conventional beauty in the bland and obvious sense. Perhaps this is true, perhaps not. Standards of attractiveness are among the most fragile of historical certainties. But beauty, especially in a court, is rarely a matter of feature alone. It lies in movement, in intelligence, in timing, in the quality of attention one gives and withholds. Anne seems to have possessed that rarer form of allure which is not exhausted by a first glance. Her dark eyes were often remarked upon. So too her animation, her wit, her musical gifts, her conversation, and that air of distinction which can make stillness more noticeable than ornament. One may picture her at court in the half-light of evening. A slender figure beneath the glow of candles, sleeves whispering as she moves, French hood framing the face with elegant economy, jewels catching here and there like drops of rain on black. Leaves. She does not flood the room with warmth. She does something more potent. She creates focus. And courts, being full of observers, feel such things immediately. By the time Anne began to move more visibly within royal circles, Henry had already lived through years of hope deferred within his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The Queen remained respected, steadfast, and honoured by many, but the absence of a surviving son had become not merely a sadness, but a problem around which minds increasingly circled. The king, once content to trust in time and providence, had entered a subtler and more restless phase. Outwardly, he remained splendid, athletic, musical, ceremonious, and fond of display. Yet inwardly, the repeated frustration of dynastic expectation had begun to chafe against his sense of kingly order. A prince who had once seemed able to harmonize with all things was discovering slowly and unwillingly that reality did not always incline toward his wishes. It was into this atmosphere of concealed strain that Anne appeared. At first, however, she was not the object of an all-consuming royal devotion. Attention in such courts shifted and shimmered. Admiration was part of the air. Henry was not unfamiliar with flirtation, nor was Anne's family without ambition. Yet what began as courtly interest gradually acquired another quality, one that seems, in retrospect, almost audible, as though beneath the ordinary music of feasts, masks, and dances, another melody had begun to thread itself, lower and more persistent, through the hall. Anne did not yield easily. This, perhaps more than anything, changed the rhythm of events. For Henry was a king accustomed to admiration and obedience, and in the realm of affection, as in the realm of politics, he had not often found himself denied. Yet Anne did not consent to become merely one more ornament in the long gallery of courtly attachment. Whether from calculation, conviction, self-respect, family strategy, religious seriousness, or some combination of all these, she held a line. She did not wholly retreat, but neither did she simply surrender to the role of mistress. In refusing to become easily possessed, she transformed desire into pursuit, and pursuit into fixation. There is something almost theatrical in this transformation, though not in a noisy sense. Rather, it resembles the gradual intensification of light around one figure on a stage, while the rest recedes by degrees into shadow. Henry began to write to Anne with a fervour that history has preserved in letters at once intimate and revealing. In them one hears impatience, admiration, longing, and the king's unfamiliar experience of waiting upon another's answer. Yet even here, in the warm folds of courtly language, one senses something larger than romance gathering behind the words. For a king does not pursue as a private man pursues. His desire moves with the weight of office behind it, and when thwarted, it may begin to search for other roads. Imagine the chamber in which such a letter is written. It is late. The day's audiences have ended. The fire burns lower, but still gives warmth enough to soften the cold pressing at the casements. On the table lie papers, seals, a knife for trimming quills, perhaps a goblet half finished and forgotten. Candlelight pools over the page, over the king's hand, over the dark wet line of ink as words are formed slowly and with unusual personal urgency. Outside, the palace settles into midnight. Inside, language itself becomes an instrument of longing. And elsewhere, perhaps in another chamber touched by dawn rather than dusk, Anne unfolds such a letter and reads it in stillness, with thought. We cannot know what she felt in every hour, and it would be too simple to cast her as either pure enchantress or passive recipient. She was a human being moving through one of the most perilous theatres in Europe, aware that royal favour could elevate and consume in the same gesture. To attract a king was no small thing. To be pursued by one while refusing the easier path laid before many before her was another matter altogether. Thus the atmosphere changed. The old question of the succession, once contained mainly within the marriage of Henry and Catherine, now found itself entangled with a living alternative. Not yet a policy, not yet a break with Rome, but the possibility, still half-formed, that the king's future might lie elsewhere. And because Anne was not willing to settle for a secondary role, desire and dynastic anxiety began, slowly, to lean upon one another, until they were almost impossible to separate. One must be careful here, especially in a tale meant to soothe rather than startle, not to flatten the complexity of this turning point into a simple story of infatuation. Henry's attraction to Anne was surely real. That much the letters and the history alike suggest. But he was also a king formed by ideas of providence, legitimacy, masculinity, and sacred monarchy. The absence of a son troubled him not merely emotionally, but conceptually. It disturbed the order in which he expected the world to reflect his kingship back to him. Anne's appearance did not create that disturbance. Rather, it offered it a shape. In her, longing found an image. In her refusal, frustration found pressure. In the possibility of marriage to her, the old problem of succession seemed, perhaps, to discover a future answer. Meanwhile, Catherine remained queen, and not a spectral figure receding politely into irrelevance, but a very real, very dignified, and very present woman, whose history, rank, and moral seriousness made any attempted displacement infinitely more difficult than a king in love might wish. She had been his wife for many years. She had represented England with distinction. She had borne grief with composure. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, aunt to the Emperor Charles V, and a woman of deep religious conscience. One could not simply move her aside like a curtain in a draughty room. She stood where law, memory, custom, and sacrament had placed her. This is partly why the courtly attachment to Anne did not remain a merely private emotional matter. It struck against structures far older and heavier than itself. Marriage, in 16th century Christendom, was no light contract to be revised at pleasure. It had theological depth, canonical protection, and international implications. If Henry began to imagine that his union with Catherine had been somehow flawed from the start, or displeasing in the sight of God, this was not simply a romantic rationalization. It became, or at least was presented as, a matter of conscience. And conscience, once invoked by a monarch, seldom remains confined to the heart. But we are still, in this chapter, at the threshold. The great machinery has not yet fully turned. Councillors still murmur more than they act. Priests and scholars have not yet exhausted themselves in argument. Europe has not yet felt the full tremor of what is to come. Instead, we remain in a suspended, dangerous interval when a king's eye rests too long in one direction, and everyone near him begins to sense that a reordering may be taking shape, though no one can yet say how far it will reach. At court, this would have been felt in 100 subtle ways. Anne's rooms may have grown more frequented by hopeful faces. Her family's standing may have gathered warmth from reflected royal attention. Rivals would have watched carefully. Supporters, if wise, would have advanced with caution. Catherine's allies would have observed with anxiety the king's increasingly visible attachment. Ambassadors, those patient readers of surface and subtext, would have sent home reports balancing fact with speculation. Every dance, every mask, every glance at table, every choice of companion in a hunting party. All could be interpreted as signs in the weather. And Anne herself, moving through this atmosphere, must have known that grace alone would not be enough. She required intelligence, and she had it. She required discipline, and she seems to have possessed that too. There is a misconception that charm and thoughtfulness cannot coexist, or that a woman who influences politics through effective power must be devoid of inward seriousness. Anne's interest in reformist religious currents, in scripture, and in intellectual exchange suggests otherwise. The silk whisper of her presence concealed, or perhaps revealed to those attentive enough, a mind alive to more than ornament. If we imagine an evening masque, torches burning in sconces, musicians half veiled in shadow, dancers turning slowly across the floor, while gold thread glimmers and sleeves unfold like wings, we may sense how intoxicating such a court could be to one who loved display. Henry did. He relished not simply pleasure but magnificence. And Anne, trained in continental polish, belonged naturally to this world of coded glance and ceremonious allure. Yet unlike the easy beauties of her passing entertainment, she did not dissolve when the music ended. She remained. She occupied thought. The king's pursuit lengthened. Years, not weeks, would pass before the matter found any formal resolution. That duration matters. A fleeting passion might have burned itself into ash and left the political order largely intact. A sustained and deepening attachment, reinforced by frustration and dynastic desperation, did something else. It invited reinterpretation. What if the marriage to Catherine had never truly been lawful? What if the lack of a son signified divine displeasure? What if what had once seemed settled now required correction? These questions did not arise in a vacuum. They grew in the warm greenhouse of longing, scriptural anxiety, and royal self-certainty. One can imagine Henry, in those years, reading and rereading passages of Leviticus with a mind already leaning toward the conclusion it desired. Such reading, once joined to personal need, can become strangely luminous to the reader. A verse no one had previously found decisive now glows with inevitability. Conscience and convenience, so difficult to separate even in the private soul, may appear to merge into one. Henry was not merely inventing a pretext in a wholly cynical spirit, nor was he purely led by honest scruple. Human motives, especially under pressure, rarely arrive in such clean divisions. Rather, he seems to have come to believe that his desire, his dynastic need, and a certain reading of divine law belong together. And Anne stood at the center of that convergence, whether as cause, catalyst, symbol, or all three at once. Catherine, meanwhile, held her ground with the same grave dignity that had long characterized her. One can feel, even from a distance of centuries, the loneliness of her position beginning to deepen. The wife who had once entered the reign as its rightful queen, admired and ceremonially secure, now found the ground beneath her shifting not through any failure of public conduct, but because time had not given the king the son he required, and because another woman had entered the field of possibility. Yet Catherine did not rage into inelegance. She remained composed, devout, and principled. In doing so, she made the king's path not easier, but morally heavier. There is a sadness in watching a world begin to tilt before it has openly fallen. We know, from our later vantage, what lies ahead. Trials of conscience, legal maneuvers, embassies, appeals to Rome, the slow strain upon old institutions, and the eventual severing of bonds once thought indivisible. But those within the unfolding present do not know the final shape of events. They know only that a pressure is building, that looks linger, that the Queen's face is a little graver, that Anne's name is more frequently spoken, that the King's mood, though still polished in company, may now and then pass into abstraction, that scholars are consulted, that scripture is discussed, that delay itself has become an actor in the drama, and delay in matters of desire can be strangely transformative. It intensifies not only emotion but meaning. What is not granted becomes more symbolic than what is easily possessed. Anne's refusal to settle for less than queenship, whether explicitly or in effect, forced Henry to imagine restructuring the world around the terms of his longing. In that respect, the silk whisper of Anne Boleyn was not weak. It was quiet power. The courtly spaces in which this power unfolded remain vivid to the imagination. Consider the galleries at twilight, where portraits watch from panelled walls and polished floors reflect uncertain candlelight. Consider the gardens in late afternoon, when gravel paths hold the day's warmth and clipped hedges darken at the edges beneath gathering mist. Consider the hunting field, with hawks hooded, horses breathing in little clouds, and courtiers speaking in low tones as the king rides near. In each of these places, political history is being made not only in councils and treaties, but in glances, proximities, hesitations, and the arrangement of bodies within space. Power, before it becomes law, is often first choreography by the later. 1520. 1520s, what had once seemed a courtly attachment, was becoming impossible to contain within the ordinary forms of flirtation. Henry wanted more than presents. He wanted resolution. He wanted an answer to the dynastic problem, and to his own inward unrest. Anne, by standing just beyond easy reach, had become inseparable from that answer in his imagination. Catherine, by standing firmly where she had long stood, became inseparable from the problem. Thus, the emotional geometry of the court hardened. And yet, as ever, the world outside the chamber continued with almost painful calm. The Thames still flowed beneath morning fog. Bakers still rose before dawn. Bells still marked the canonical hours. Fires were lit, tables laid, accounts recorded, prayers murmured, sleeves mended, horses saddled, pages sent scurrying through draughty passages. History does not announce itself each morning to those living inside it. It lets the ordinary persist, even while foundations begin to shift beneath the familiar floorboards. This is perhaps why the chapter bears the title it does. Anne came first as a whisper, not a trumpet. A rustle of silk in a court already full of pageantry, a new cadence in conversation, a pair of dark eyes and a cultivated reserve, and yet whispers, if repeated long enough in the right chamber, may alter the course of kingdoms more surely than shouted commands. So let us leave the court for tonight in that poised and unsettled state. Henry remains enthralled, though the full consequences of his enthrallment have not yet ripened into action. Anne stands luminous and elusive, no mere passing ornament, but a figure around whom desire, ambition, and conscience have begun to gather. Catherine remains queen in law, in dignity, and in moral stature, though her future is no longer sheltered as it once was. Around them the courtiers watch, the scholars murmur, the musicians play on, and the rain moves softly over palace roofs, as though nothing in the world were changing at all. Yet something has changed. The air has altered. The old harmony no longer resolves as before, and in the long candlelit galleries of Tudor England, beneath painted beams and the quiet gaze of saints, the first notes of transformation have already begun to sound, low, velvet soft, and impossible now to silence the great severing, crown, church, and the Queen in shadow. Let us return quietly and without any abruptness to England in the years when candlelight still governed the rhythm of evening, when prayer rose through vaulted stone before dawn, and when the Husham royal chambers could conceal, for a little while, the vast and delicate strain being placed upon a kingdom's soul. Outside, the rain moves across the city in a fine silver veil, resting on rooftops, tracing old walls, and gathering in the seams of worn stone. The Thames, dark beneath a low sky, carries the pale reflection of wavering lights from windows high above the water. Somewhere within the palace precincts a shutter stirs gently in the wind. Somewhere else, in a corridor panelled with oak and shadow, a single candle burns low and steady, making a small golden island in the dark. In the previous chapter, we lingered at the threshold, at the moment when Anne Boleyn's presence, graceful and elusive, had begun to alter the atmosphere of the Tudor court, and when King Henry's long frustration over the absence of a son had found in that presence a new and irresistible shape. Now, however, we move into deeper waters. What had once been feeling becomes argument. What had once been longing becomes policy. What had once been a private disturbance begins to press against institutions older than memory within any one human life. And yet even this transformation does not arrive as a crash. It comes, rather, as a long unfastening, like the careful removal of embroidery from cloth, stitch by stitch, until one suddenly sees that the pattern is changed beyond repair. For England's break with Rome is often imagined in dramatic outlines: king against pope, desire against law, crown against church. And those outlines are not false precisely, but they are incomplete. In lived experience, the severing was slower, stranger, and more hushed than a simple clash of thunder. It unfolded through legal chambers heavy with parchment and candle smoke, through whispered consultations, through sermons, signatures, delays, silences, and the endless patient labour by which power teaches itself to wear new garments while pretending, at first, not to have changed at all. At the centre of it stood Henry, still vigorous, still splendid in outward bearing, still capable of charm and cultivated brilliance, yet now increasingly persuaded that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had been wrong in the sight of God and obstructive in the life of the realm. Whether this conviction arose from genuine conscience, from desire for Anne, from dynastic anxiety, or from some intimate weaving of all three, it had by now taken on a seriousness that could not be dismissed as passing infatuation. The king was no longer merely enamoured. He was resolved. To Henry's mind, the matter came to seem not simply personal, but providential. He had married, years earlier, the widow of his brother Arthur, and although papal dispensation had allowed the union, Scripture now stood before him with a new and disquieting brightness. Passages that might once have rested quietly in the background of theological life began to press upon his imagination with a terrible relevance. The absence of a surviving son could be read, if one were inclined to read it so, as divine commentary. What had looked like private sorrow became, in this interpretation, a sign. And signs, when read by kings, have long consequences. One may imagine Henry in an inner chamber, the fire low, the night deep beyond the windows, while clerics and advisers place before him texts, commentaries, precedents, and possibilities. The room smells of wax, leather, and the dust of books often opened only in moments of necessity. A secretary waits with pen in hand. A theologian clears his throat softly. The king, broad-shouldered and intent, leans over. Scripture not as a detached scholar, but as a man searching for order in what feels increasingly like frustration. He is not a modern cynic, nor is he an innocent. He is something more human and therefore more difficult. A ruler whose desire and conscience have grown entangled until each seems to justify the other. Against this gathering force stood Catherine, not merely as wife, but as queen, as Princess of Spain, as aunt to the Emperor Charles V, and as a woman whose own understanding of the marriage was anchored in sacrament, honour, and truth. She did not accept that their union had been invalid. She did not believe herself to have lived in sin. She knew the canonical arguments. She knew her own history. And perhaps most importantly, she knew who she was. There is something almost architectural in Catherine's dignity during these years. She does not blaze. She endures. She stands like an old chapel through weather, stone darkened by rain, windows dimmed by age, but foundations deep and unmoved. The first stage of the king's campaign took place, as so many great political dramas do, in paperwork and persuasion. Henry sought an annulment, a declaration that the marriage to Catherine had never been valid. This required, in theory, the cooperation of the papacy. In practice, however, the matter was tangled in European politics of almost unbearable delicacy. Pope Clement VII, no abstract pontiff floating above worldly affairs, lived under the shadow of the Holy Roman Emperor, who happened to be Catherine's nephew. Rome was not free in the way Henry may have wished it to be. It hesitated, delayed, balanced, deferred. Delay by now had become one of the great emotional climates of the Tudor court. Anne Boleyn, whose position depended increasingly upon the king's success, could not remain indefinitely in the half-light between lady and queen. Henry, already made impatient by years of dynastic frustration, found papal hesitation intolerable. Catherine held firm. Advisers split or repositioned themselves. Scholars searched libraries for precedents. Canon lawyers assembled arguments like men building bridges over deep and uncertain water. Meanwhile, the court continued outwardly to glow. There were still banquets, still hunts, still rich garments carried from wardrobe rooms scented with cedar and wool, still music in evening galleries, still priests in procession, candles raised. Yet in all such splendor one may sense now a strain beneath the silk, as though the embroidery had been stretched too tightly over the frame. The most visible and sorrowful symbol of this strain came in the proceedings that sought to examine the validity of the royal marriage. We need not enter them in sharp detail. It is enough to say that Catherine was called upon in the public theatre of law and authority to hear her marriage weighed as though it were an error to be corrected. One of the most remembered moments from this period is her appeal directly to Henry, delivered not with fury, but with grave and moving dignity. She knelt before him, not as a supplicant in the ordinary sense, but as a wife appealing to memory, conscience, and justice. It was a scene suffused with quiet tragedy. The Queen asking not merely for a verdict, but for recognition of shared years, shared vows, and shared truth. The image lingers because it reveals so much. Henry, for all his majesty, could not make the past cease to have been lived. Catherine, for all her vulnerability, possessed a moral weight that law alone could not easily dissolve. Anne, for all the king's devotion, waited still beyond the threshold of secure legitimacy. Rome delayed, England watched, and time, that patient and unsympathetic architect, kept building pressure in the walls. It was in these years that Thomas Wolsey, the king's great minister, began to fade from favour. Wolsey had long been one of the principal architects of Tudor government. Brilliant, industrious, magnificent in display, and trusted with immense authority. But great ministers thrive only so long as they can satisfy royal need, and here lay the limit of even Wolsey's skill. He could negotiate, flatter, organize, and maneuver with extraordinary finesse. He could not compel the Pope to grant what Europe's tangled politics forbade. And so the king's frustration, finding no immediate solution, sought its object among those closest to him. Wolsey's fall was less a dramatic plunge than a long dimming, a withdrawing of warmth from a once bright centre. The cardinal, who had moved through palaces with scarlet grandeur, now found himself increasingly exposed to disappointment and suspicion. In Tudor life, favour could feel like sunlight, and its loss like the first hard chill of autumn in a room whose windows had been left unlatched. With Wolsey diminished, other minds and hands moved nearer to the king. Among them rose Thomas Cromwell, a man of very different temper, practical, penetrating, and notably alive to the possibilities of law and administration as instruments of transformation. If Wolsey belonged in some measure to the older world of splendid church statesmanship, Cromwell would prove one of the principal engineers of the new order. Where others saw only obstruction, he began to see roots. Where delay thickened the air, he looked for levers. Alongside him stood Thomas Cranmer, scholar and cleric, whose role in the unfolding drama would become profound. These men did not create Henry's desire, nor his grievance, nor Anne's significance. Rather, they offered machinery by which those forces might take form, and form, once given to royal will, may become difficult for a nation to resist. For the king's answer, gradually, was to shift the ground upon which the question itself had been asked. If Rome would not deliver the required judgment, perhaps England need no longer submit the matter to Rome. The thought, once entertained, contained within it a revolution wrapped in legal language. The papacy's authority in English affairs, never free from political tension, might be reduced, challenged, or bypassed. The king, already supreme in temporal matters, might become something more in relation to the church within his own realm. This change did not happen all at once. It came by acts, statutes, pressure, appointments, oaths, each one perhaps manageable in itself, yet together forming a bridge from one world into another. Parliament was involved. Clergy were pressed. Revenue, jurisdiction, appeals. All the old channels by which ecclesiastical authority flowed between England and Rome were examined, narrowed, redirected. It was as though a river long accustomed to one course were being coaxed, bank by bank, into another bed. To ordinary people, the effect may at first have seemed uncertain, more administrative than apocalyptic. Priests still said Mass, bells still rang, candles still burned before altars. The saints in stained glass did not vanish in a night. Yet beneath the continuity of ritual, foundations were shifting. Words spoken in legal formulae, signatures placed beneath royal authority, altered the invisible architecture of obedience. England was beginning to loosen its ancient fastening to Rome, not in a sudden lunge, but in a series of cool and deliberate motions. And at the centre of this great severing stood, still, the intimate human triangle from which it had in part arisen. Henry seeking freedom and future, Catherine defending truth and honour, Anne waiting upon the transformation of law into marriage. When Anne at last rose into queenship, the ascent carried both triumph and unease. The long pursuit had achieved its object in form, but form is not the same as rest. A woman who has been desired for years, and for whom a king has bent institutions, does not step into secure happiness as though into a warm parlour after rain. She enters instead a brighter and more precarious stage, Every eye is upon her, every gesture is measured, every absence is noted. Expectation, once a source of power, becomes a weight. The coronation of Anne Boleyn was all Tudor magnificence. Barges upon the Thames, cloth of gold, heraldry, jewels, processions through London, bells, prayers, and the whole sumptuous language by which monarchy translates political fact into sensory certainty. One may imagine the river alive with reflected torchlight, the city streets hung for celebration, the murmur of crowds beneath balconies and painted cloth, the Queen herself radiant beneath ceremonial weight, moving through spaces prepared to tell the kingdom that a new order had already begun. And yet splendor, however persuasive, cannot wholly command the heart. There were many in England who admired Catherine still, or doubted Anne, or simply felt uneasy before the visible rearrangement of what had once seemed sacred and settled. Pageantry can instruct the eye, but inward loyalties may continue to kneel elsewhere. Anne's queenship, therefore, was never one of untroubled ease. It glittered, certainly. It commanded. It occupied the throne's intimate space beside the king. But it also lived under the pressure of justification. She must not simply reign. She must prove the king had been right to choose her. She must deliver what Catherine had not. Above all, a son. There is in this a terrible symmetry. The woman for whom the old queen had been displaced was now bound to the same dynastic demand, perhaps even more tightly than before. Desire had raised her. Expectation would test her. When Anne gave birth in 1533, not to a son, but to a daughter, the future Elizabeth, the moment was at once joyful and shadowed. A living child, healthy and royal, was no small blessing. The king's line was extended, yet the anticipated male heir had not appeared. One can feel, even through the embroidered language of celebration, that slight inward pause, the little silence behind the bells. A daughter could be cherished, and would be, but the old hunger remained, and so the machinery did not sleep. Meanwhile, the wider consequences of the break with Rome continued to unfurl. Monasteries, those ancient places of prayer, labour, hospitality and memory, increasingly found themselves under scrutiny. At first the changes came through visitations, valuations, legal formulations. The quiet bureaucratic prelude to what would later become dissolution. It is useful in a sleep story such as this not to treat these places only as institutions, but as environments. Imagine a monastery at dawn, mist over the fields, bells calling the brethren to prayer, feet soft on stone, candles burning in the choir, the smell of wet earth outside and wax within. Such houses had structured English spiritual life for generations. Their future, too, would now be altered by the king's severing. Yet even as national transformation gathered pace, the emotional heart of the story remained deeply personal. Catherine, set aside in law but not in conscience, entered her years of separation with grave composure. She was no longer accorded the full honours of queenship. Titles shifted, access narrowed, residences changed, but dignity remained where ceremony had been reduced. There is something deeply affecting in the image of her later life, removed from the centre, yet not inwardly diminished, surrounded perhaps by fewer attendants, less splendour, less daily closeness to power, and yet more clearly than ever herself. One may picture her in a quieter house, the winter light thin upon the walls, the fire carefully tended, letters beside her, a devotional book open, the sounds of the larger court, at a distance now rather than near. She has lost much, but not conviction. If there is sorrow, it has settled not into spectacle, but into depth. Henry, on the other hand, had achieved what he wanted in immediate form: separation from Catherine, marriage to Anne, a redefinition of authority. Yet satisfaction did not come in simple measure. It rarely does when one has had to reshape the world to fit an inward necessity. The mind that bends institutions to secure peace often discovers afterwards that inward weather remains unsettled. New anxieties arise, new proofs are demanded, new disappointments gather at the edge of expectation, and Anne, brilliant and elevated though she was, began increasingly to feel the peril of a court in which favour is both sunlight and exposure. Her sharp intelligence, once part of her enchantment, could become dangerous in an atmosphere where many resented her. Her position had been one at too great a cost to be taken for granted. If she failed to give the king a son, what then? The question, once Catherine's burden, now lay coiled within Anne's chamber too. Thus chapter 4 moves not toward rest, but toward a strange and glittering unease. England has not ceased to pray, yet its prayers are now offered under a different configuration of authority. The king has not ceased to be magnificent, yet his magnificence is no longer merely youthful. It is legislative, transformative, and increasingly accustomed to forcing reality to align with royal conviction. Catherine has not ceased to be queen in spirit, though law and favour have withdrawn their public shelter. Anne has reached the throne, though the throne beneath her is less secure than her peers. The church still stands in stone, but its invisible loyalties are being redrawn, sentence by sentence. And all of this, the legal arguments, the papal delays, the rise of new ministers, the redefinition of obedience, the dimming of monasteries, the lonely steadfastness of Catherine, the dazzling and anxious ascent of Anne, has unfolded not with one great crash, but with the patient inevitability of water wearing its path through rock. So let us leave the kingdom here for the night, suspended between splendour and strain, between old prayers and new powers, between the queen in shadow and the queen in light, between the memory of sacred continuity and the sharp-edged invention of a different future. The rain goes on falling over the roofs of London. The river slides beneath its bridges in silence. Candles shorten in their brass holders. Ink dries upon decrees. A chapel lamp burns before a painted saint, and in chambers high and low across the realm, England turns in its sleep, not yet fully aware of how much has already been unstitched. The Six Wives in the Turning Gallery. Let us return gently once more to the Tudor world, where history moves not always in straight lines, but often like candlelight along a corridor, wavering, returning, lengthening over polished boards and fading tapestries, revealing one face after another in its soft and uncertain glow. Outside, evening has folded itself over the palaces of England with that familiar mingling of damp air, river mist, and low cloud, which so often seems to belong not only to the weather of the realm, but to its memory as well. The windows are dark mirrors now, silvered faintly by rain. The courtyard stones gleam. Somewhere below, hooves sound briefly upon wet ground and then recede. A door opens, closes. The hush returns. We have already passed through the first bright chapters of Henry's life. The Golden Prince, the young king, the long marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the silk whisper of Anne Boleyn, and the great severing by which crown and church were drawn into a new and uneasy arrangement. Now we enter a different chamber of the story, a gallery of women moving one after another through the later weather of the king's reign, each leaving behind not merely an episode, but an atmosphere. It is tempting, in ordinary retellings, to reduce these wives to a pattern, to a rhyme, to a sequence memorized more readily than understood. But in the slower light by which we travel tonight, they are not tokens arranged upon a historical shelf. They are women enclosed within one of the most brilliant and perilous courts in Europe, each bringing to it her own hopes, temper, education, vulnerabilities, and forms of quiet endurance. If Henry is the great central fire around which the court turns, they are not mere moths drawn helplessly to the flame. They are, rather, figures passing through a long gallery of portraits: Jane, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, each illuminated differently by the same candle, each marked by the peculiar weather of her time beside the king. And so, before we continue, let us imagine the gallery itself. A long chamber, panelled in dark wood, lit here and there by candles set in brackets along the wall. The flames throw pools of honey-coloured light across painted faces and rich fabrics captured in stillness. A queen's hand rests upon a chair. A pendant glimmers at her throat. A sleeve, painted in impossible detail, seems almost to rustle when the draught passes. The boards beneath our feet are worn smooth by generations. From far away comes the faint murmur of a fire, or the whisper of rain against the casement panes. We walk slowly. We stop before one portrait, then another. Time itself seems to breathe more quietly here. The first figure in this turning gallery is Jane Seymour. After the dazzling rise and deeply shadowed fall of Anne Boleyn, the court must have felt for a time like a room after a storm has passed. Not peaceful exactly, but hushed, as though everyone present were listening for what might follow. Anne's season had been bright with intellect, tension, controversy, and expectation. Jane's entrance offered something different: gentleness, restraint, and a kind of soft, pale composure that seemed, perhaps, to promise the king relief from turbulence. Jane did not carry the same sharp-edged brilliance as Anne, nor the same continental sophistication. She came from an established gentry family with court connections, and had served both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. There is something almost symbolic in that passage, as though she had moved quietly through the shadows of earlier queens, before stepping at last into the candlelight herself. She seems, in surviving impressions, to have been modest in manner, careful in speech, and possessed of that still quality which often attracts those weary of dramatic intensity. To Henry, who had lived through years of marital disappointment, public theological upheaval, and emotional strain, Jane may have seemed like morning after a fevered night. One imagines her not amid the glittering, verbally charged theatre that had surrounded Anne, but in quieter settings: a chapel aisle, a privy chamber, an embroidery frame near a window where pale daylight falls across linen and thread. Her power was not in sparkle, it was in calm. And calm to a king who longed above all else now for dynastic resolution had become deeply attractive. Jane married Henry in 1536. 1536, only a short time after Anne's departure from the world, and the swiftness of that transition gives the story a hush all its own. Tudor history often moves with startling speed, but if we resist sharpness and listen instead for emotional texture, what we hear is not haste so much as the relentless continuity of court life. The candles are trimmed, the musicians play again, new garments are commissioned, new prayers are said. The palace, whatever private sorrows or astonishments have passed through it, continues. And into that continuity Jane steps, gentle and white-handed, carrying the immense expectation that now attached itself to every woman who approached the throne. She did what no previous wife had succeeded in doing. She gave Henry a living son. In 1537, Prince Edward was born, and with his birth something long clenched in the Tudor imagination at last seemed to relax. One can almost hear the deep exhalation of the kingdom. Bells rang, messages sped outward. Fires may have burned later than usual in kitchens and guardrooms alike. In nurseries and chapels, relief mingled with thanksgiving. For Henry, this was more than paternal joy. It was vindication, fulfillment, proof. The son whose absence had shadowed marriages, arguments, laws, and institutions had finally arrived, small and living, wrapped in linen and destiny. There is a tenderness in imagining that chamber, the queen exhausted yet radiant with accomplishment, attendants moving quietly with basins and cloths, the child breathing the soft, almost unbelievable breath of new life, candles lowered against the night, and the king somewhere near, perhaps softened for a moment by gratitude powerful enough to still even his restless mind. Yet This softness did not remain long. Jane, after giving Henry the son he had so desperately sought, did not linger in the world. Her strength ebbed in the days that followed Edward's birth, and she passed from courtly life as though slipping into a deeper and more complete night. We need not render the scene sharply. It is enough to picture the room growing quieter, the attendants slower in their movements, prayers deepening in tone, and the autumn air. Beyond the casements turning colder while within the chamber, one candle after another burned low beside the Queen, who had delivered what England most desired, and then too soon grown still. Her memory, therefore, acquired a peculiar tenderness in Henry's mind. Jane became not merely the third wife, but the mother of his son. The Queen associated with fulfillment and loss are joined together so closely that neither could be thought without the other. In later years, he would be buried beside her, a fact that, in its still way, tells us something. Of all the women in the turning gallery, Jane remained linked to him in death by the simple and immense reality that she had given him the male heir. Yet even with Edward in the nursery, the palace did not become a place of permanent peace. One long anxiety had been answered. Others remained. A son is not the same as stability. An infant prince may secure succession in theory, but court life, European politics, and the king's own temperament continue to move restlessly on. And so the gallery turns, and we come to Anne of Cleves. Her arrival has about it the quality of winter fog over water, muted, uncertain, and touched with a strange distance of a face first known through representation rather than presence by the late 1530. 1530s, Henry was older, broader, less dazzlingly youthful than before, though still formidable and acutely conscious of majesty. England's religious settlement remained unsettled in many respects, and alliances on the continent carried renewed urgency. A marriage with a German Protestant-connected house offered political advantage. Anne of Cleves, sister to the Duke of Cleves, entered the king's horizon first through portraiture, diplomacy, and negotiation. There is something deeply Tudor in that. The possibility that a life may be transformed because a painted likeness carried across countries and placed before a monarch seemed to promise suitability. Hans Holbein's famous portrait of Anne has its own still enchantment. A composed woman, richly dressed, quiet in expression, dignified and opaque. One imagines Henry studying such a likeness in a warm chamber, while winter pressed at the windows, hoping perhaps not only for alliance, but for some renewal of comfort, some agreeable companionship to settle the later years of his reign. Reality, when Anne at last arrived in England, failed to align with expectation. Yet even here, it is kinder and more truthful to avoid the coarse simplifications that later centuries have loved too well. Anne of Cleves was no grotesque misapprehension. She was a noblewoman shaped by a different court culture, a different language, a different style of presentation. Henry, aging and increasingly exacting, encountered not merely a woman, but the discomfort of his own changing nature reflected back at him. The disappointment seems to have been his more than hers. The famous awkwardness of their first meeting, the failure of ease, the thinning of enthusiasm, all these belong less to ridicule than to the melancholy of mismatched expectation. One pictures Anne entering the English court like a figure stepping out of a painted panel and into cold air not yet accustomed to her. The rooms are splendid, the customs unfamiliar, the language around her a flowing current she cannot fully inhabit, and the king himself more complex, less golden, and perhaps less generous than the image she may have been encouraged to expect. Their marriage, solemnized in 1540. 1540 did not flower into intimacy. Instead, it settled almost at once into distance. Yet among Henry's wives, Anne of Cleves occupies a strangely peaceful place in retrospect. The marriage was annulled with a degree of courtesy rare in his story. She accepted the arrangement, was granted generous terms, and remained in England with honour as the king's sister. There is a quiet intelligence in the path she took. By not resisting in a way that challenged Henry's self-image, and by adapting with tact to the settlement offered, she secured a safety that others did not. One may imagine her later life in England not as triumphant perhaps, but as unexpectedly gentle. Houses kept warm, servants attending, a degree of independence, occasional appearances at court, and the inward knowledge that she had passed through the lion's den and emerged not unscathed exactly, but unbroken. The gallery turns again. Now comes Catherine Howard, and the air changes at once. Where Jane was pale calm and Anne of Cleves was diplomatic winter, Catherine Howard enters like candlelight, quickened by laughter in a draughty hall. She was very young, painfully young, when one considers the age and experience of the king, and she belonged to the Howard family, one of the great noble houses of England, with all the ambition and peril such lineage could contain. Contemporary impressions often present her as lively, charming, graceful, and full of that youthful brightness which can seem at court both refreshing and dangerous. To Henry, older now and increasingly conscious of age, bodily discomfort, and the fading of the effortless magnificence of youth, Catherine must have felt like a return of spring music heard from a distant room. In her presence he may have imagined not only delight, but restoration, as though admiration from the young could cast a softer light upon his own decline. One imagines the king watching her move in a chamber lit by torches, her jewels alive in the glow, her laughter low and bright, the air around her carrying not the solemn intelligence of Anne Boleyn, nor the grave composure of Catherine of Aragon, but something lighter, quicker, almost perilously unformed. To a court always alert to mood, the effect would have been immediate. The king was animated, attention shifted, favour gathered. They married in 1540. 1540, the same year Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was set aside, and for a brief period the court seems to have basked in a warmer, more playful atmosphere. There were jewels, gifts, affectionate titles, visible delight. Yet such brightness in Tudor life could be fragile. A very young queen, raised amid inadequate discipline, stepping into the most dangerous court in the realm, carried more vulnerability than splendor could conceal. The expectations placed upon her were vast, the structures around her unforgiving. What followed has often been told with all the sharpness of scandal. We will not do that here. It is enough to say that whispers gathered around her past and her conduct, and that in Henry's court whispers, once caught by the machinery of inquiry, seldom remain soft for long. The king who had invested Catherine Howard with affection and perhaps with fantasies of renewed youth, now found himself confronted by a reality that wounded not only his trust, but his vanity, his sense of order, and his need to believe in the sincerity of what had comforted him. For Catherine Howard, the season of queenship was brief. Her rise had the fragile brilliance of frost on a winter morning, glittering beautifully just before the sun dissolves it. She passed from favour into darkness with heartbreaking swiftness, and whatever errors, naivetés, or imprudences lay in her story, one cannot help but feel the pathos of her youth. She seems less a grand political figure than a young woman enclosed within forces too large, too formal, and too mercilessly adult for her. And then, at last, we come to Catherine Parr. If the previous wives in this gallery each embody a different emotional climate, endurance, brilliance, fulfillment, mismatch, youth, Catherine Parr enters with something like late evening intelligence. She was not a girl. She was a mature woman, twice widowed, educated, thoughtful, and notably capable of navigating both conversation and danger. By the time Henry married her in 1543, he was no longer the radiant prince of chapter 1, nor even the forcefully desirous monarch of his middle years. He was aging, often in discomfort, increasingly heavy in body, quick to assert authority, and surrounded by faction. To be his wife now required not enchantment alone, nor fertility alone, but vigilance, composure, and tact of a high order. Catherine Parr possessed these things. There is something deeply impressive in her style of queenship. She appears not as a romantic answer to the king's hunger, but as a woman capable of creating order in the late, difficult rooms of his reign. She was scholarly, interested in religion, fond of learning, and able to converse with seriousness. She also seems to have had a genuine gift for domestic and dynastic care. Under her influence, Henry's children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, experienced a degree of household cohesion not always present before. Catherine became, in effect, a keeper of the royal dusk, a woman tending relationships, conversations, reading, and political sensibilities while the day of Henry's life declined toward evening. Imagine her in a warm chamber lined with books, candles burning steadily rather than flamboyantly, papers arranged with order upon a table, the sounds of the larger court softened by distance. Here she reads, writes, converses with learned company, oversees household matters, and moves carefully between sincerity and survival. She was pious, yes, but not inertly so. She engaged with reformist religious thought, and even published under her own name. No small thing for a queen in such a court. Yet with belief came risk. Henry's later court was alive with religious tension, with factions watchful for signs of error, excess, or advantage. At one moment, Catherine herself approached danger when her religious discussions and reformist sympathies made her vulnerable to conservative enemies. Yet she survived through intelligence and timing. Seeing the king's displeasure gathering, she softened the terms of exchange, presenting herself not as a challenger in doctrine, but as a humble companion who sought only to distract and converse with him. It was a master class in self-preservation wrapped in deference. She understood, perhaps better than any before her, that in Henry's later years, one did not survive by winning arguments, but by letting the king retain the appearance of mastery, while quietly stepping out of the path of his displeasure. Thus Catherine Parr became the final wife, not because she charmed most dazzlingly, nor because she fulfilled most completely, but because she endured with intelligence where endurance itself had become the highest art. So here, in this turning gallery, the later wives pass before us one by one. Jane Seymour, pale and tranquil, bringing the longed-for prince, and then receding softly from the world, before she could fully inhabit the peace she had created. Anne of Cleves, stepping from portrait into palace, finding not romance, but a courteous and unexpectedly survivable distance. Catherine Howard, all youth and shimmer, a brief candle in a draught, too delicate for the cold machinery surrounding her. Catherine Parr, composed among books and embers, presiding not over the king's dawn or noon, but over his late evening, when the light is lower and requires steadier hands. Each reveals something different, not only about Henry, but about queenship itself under the Tudors. A queen might be asked to soothe, to bear, to adorn, to heal faction, to produce heirs, to embody policy, to survive scrutiny, to kneel in prayer, to smile through fear, to comfort a king, to mother his children, to say less than she knew, and to know more than she said. No wonder their stories feel less like a list and more like weather passing through one house over many years. And what of Henry in the midst of them all? He changes, of course. He has been changing all along. The young prince who shone in athletic grace and humanist promise now appears increasingly as a monarch enclosed by his own appetites, ailments, memories, and assertions of will. Yet he is not one thing only. He remains capable of affection, of ceremony, of cultivated taste, of intellectual seriousness in his own way. He is also increasingly suspicious, impatient, and wounded by disappointment. The wives are often used to illuminate him. but they also show us his passage through time, from bright youth to anxious middle years, from urgency to heaviness, from pursuit to possession, from splendor to a more burdened majesty. And the court, ever responsive, alters around him. The music remains, but the key changes. The fabrics remain rich, but they drape over older bodies and more watchful minds. The chapels still hold candles, but the prayers offered there now belong to a church, no longer simply joined to Rome. The nurseries hold royal children whose futures will shape England in ways no one fully yet understands. And in the galleries hang portraits that capture stillness, while life below them continues in all its uncertainty. If one stands at the end of that imagined gallery and turns back for a final look, the wives seem almost to move in procession through the half-light, not as caricatures, not as a mnemonic verse, but as women bearing different burdens under the same crown shadow. One with folded hands in Spanish gravity, one with dark eyes and French polish, one with pale calm and a cradle at her side, one from beyond the water, dignified in unfamiliar rooms, one very young, bright as laughter by torchlight, one with books, tact, and the long patience of evening. Together they form not simply the biography of a king, but an entire emotional architecture of Tudor England, a palace of splendor built over uncertainty, lit by devotion and appetite alike, echoing with music, prayer, childbirth, whisper, and the endless soft tread of those who moved through its chambers, hoping to remain unbroken. Tonight we pause in the gallery itself, among portraits and candle smoke, while beyond the windows the rain continues its quiet silver work upon the stone. The fire settles. The footsteps fade. The faces remain. And history, patient as ever, waits with the next door already slightly open, the last winter of Henry and the echo he left behind. Let us return one final time to Tudor England, and let us do so very quietly, as one enters a chapel late in the evening when the candles have already burned down to shorter flames, and the great carved space, though still beautiful, has begun to belong more to silence than to ceremony. Outside, winter has taken hold of the land with that familiar English gentleness that is never quite gentle. A chill in the stone, a dampness in the air, a pale sky hanging low over the Thames, and a fine rain moving across rooftops and battlements like a veil drawn carefully by an unseen hand. The river itself, dark and slow beneath the fading light, keeps its ancient course beside palaces, towers, stairs, and wharves, carrying with it reflections of lanterns and windows that tremble upon the surface and then disappear. Inside, the rooms of the royal houses are warm where they can be warm, though never entirely free of draught and shadow. Tapestries soften the walls, but cannot wholly silence the murmur of wind at the casement. Fires breathe their slow red heat into chambers panelled with dark oak. Candles stand in silver and brass, their light catching on the rims of cups, on embroidery, on rings laid aside at night upon tables crowded with papers and devotional books. Servants move quietly in felted shoes. Doors open and shut with care. Somewhere in a neighbouring room, a physician speaks in a low voice. Somewhere else, a clerk bends over a document while sand dries the ink. The palace continues, as all great houses do, to perform its routines even when the pulse at its centre has begun to falter. This is the last winter of Henry. Not necessarily one single season in the strictest count of months, but the long inward winter of his final years, when the bright athletic force of his youth had retreated, and the king who had once dazzled with motion, music, and magnificence now moved through his own grandeur more heavily, carrying with him not only the body that had grown burdensome, but the accumulated weather of all that had passed. There is something almost unbearably human in the contrast. We have known him first as the Golden Prince, broad-shouldered and radiant, delighting in books, song, theological debate, hunting fields, chapel music, and all the visible theatre of kingship. We have watched him become the husband of Catherine of Aragon, then the pursuer of Anne Boleyn, then the architect of England's great severing from Rome. We have seen queens rise and recede, courtiers approach and vanish, daughters and a son emerge from the uncertain nursery into the line of succession. And now, as the years gather around him, Henry appears in another light, still majestic, still formidable, still a king whose word carried immense consequence, but no longer effortless in his relation to the world or to himself. His body, by these later years, had become a kingdom of discomfort. Injury sustained long before, especially from the jousting accident that had once shocked the court, seemed to have deepened with time into chronic pain and difficulty. Movement, once graceful and admired, grew restricted. Flesh gathered, energy altered. The king, who had loved the vitality of display, now had to negotiate with his own physical limitations, and such negotiation can sour even a naturally expansive spirit. We need not dwell in any harshness. It is enough to imagine how the grand robes, once borne with athletic ease, must now have settled more heavily upon him. How the stairs, the ceremonies, the prolonged audiences, the very act of being seen at all times in majesty, may have required more effort than anyone around him would dare acknowledge aloud. Pain changes the weather of a court, even when no one speaks of it directly. It alters temper, patience, rhythm, appetite, and the threshold at which irritation rises. It narrows certain pleasures and intensifies the need for control. Henry, always accustomed to being central, could scarcely have found such diminishment easy. And because kings live publicly even in private distress, his body did not belong only to himself. It was read, interpreted, managed, hidden where possible, and converted into ritual forms that would preserve the image of sovereignty. Yet sovereignty itself remained potent. If anything, In the later years, the machinery of royal authority stood more consolidated than before. The break with Rome had strengthened the crown's supremacy in England. Monastic wealth had flowed outward into new channels. Obedience had been reconfigured. Parliament, law, administration, and proclamation all served a monarchy more assertive and more central than the one Henry had inherited. The church within the realm had been drawn beneath the orbit of the crown. Great houses had risen and fallen according to the king's favour. Men who once seemed immovable had vanished into silence. In this sense, Henry's later reign possessed a formidable solidity. The cost of it, however, hung in the air like smoke after many candles have been extinguished. Around him now were not the eager, unclouded mornings of youth, but the dimmer and more careful afternoons of power. Courtiers measured their words. Physicians hovered with tact. Secretaries multiplied papers